I think this week we can kick things off with we have a new feature. I suppose we could call it that, but something that can add a lot of value. I know we've looked at it internally from the web team and sort of um the web dev team will sort of start kicking the tires and sort of using it out. But Ephemeral Environments has is it fully shipped? I think it's fully out, yeah.
It's still in early access right now.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, so uh, but it is out for all of our cloud customers, which is actually really
Nice.
cool. So they get a chance to, you know, test it out, kick the tires, find out all the other good stuff that comes from it. So really
Yeah.
excited about this feature. This is one of the features that I've wanted in Octopus Deploy probably since I set up three static environments at a company to handle different testing into those different work streams. And I imagine you probably run into this as well, is that you rarely have like one pair of developers working on an application, especially if it's a big project. Oftentimes you have multiple pairs or multiple developers working on different feature branches, working on different bits and pieces, and they kind of need their own shared testing environment to get feedback from. Because not too many QA people that I know of are really fond of connecting directly to my machine. Because it could be down, it could be all those other different types of things, and so they want to push something up, they want to get feedback, they want to make sure, yes, I am building the right thing before I merge it into main, before I've gone through the whole ceremony of doing all of that, because you have to do the pull requests, you have to, probably pass all the security validations and do everything like that. You want feedback as fast as possible, and so with ephemeral environments, what we're allowing you to do is basically create these short-lived ephemeral environments within Octopus Deploy in a native way. Now, I've come up with ways to hack it in there, but this is a much more native way it's very nicely supported.
Hmm. Yeah.
I love
I
this
think
because this reminds me of pretty much everywhere that I worked, like going back 25 years. There's a whiteboard somewhere where everyone competes for an environment to put something on to show it to people.
Yeah.
It's like it's always a problem. Like everyone's working on something a little bit different, and they just want to show it to someone. They want to show a stakeholder, or they want to get it in front of some testers. Just get that early feedback. Is this going in the right direction? And it's like everyone's going around begging. Are you using test one? Okay, what about test two? Are you using test? Oh, okay. What about test three? I was like, well, we don't have a test three, and no one's getting one anytime soon. So this is just like solves that whole competition for an environment.
Well, it also, because you can name environments based off your branch name. And hopefully you're creating your branch name that's more than just, Bob J. Walker 1 or something like that. It's a bit more verbose in terms of the feature or the functionality that you're working on or the story that you're working on. If you're and so it's much better than, hey, what environment are you using? Oh, I'm on dev 1 or I'm on dev 2, because I mean that's really hard for someone to understand, because it could also be going to the wrong environment, and then you start getting all these bug reports and like, I don't see this feature, or it doesn't work as I expect. I'm like, I know you're on dev 2, you should have been on dev 1, and now we're leveraging the branch name on something like this.
I like how you said that we name branches better. If I see another patch one branch, I'm just going to delete it without even giving any feedback. Like, name your branches, people.
That's,
we
because I do a lot of demos. That's the hardest thing for me to do, is sometimes come up with a really good branch name as opposed to demo one.
we uh we bump into this a little now, very, very rarely. There's not enough people on the web team working on different branches for it to be a major issue, but occasionally we have a dev A, dev B, and dev C essentially. But occasionally it's like, oh, don't deploy to dev B. This thing's here. Like, go to dev A and say that's the height of our pain that we feel. But so that's I think that in my mind the two big sort of value pillars is that kind of efficiency. You can spin something up, put it here, have a look, show it to somebody. Am I right in thinking the other big sort of value is is a cost thing? So I would imagine at some scale, in our case, Dev A, Dev B, Dev C, they just live forever, and whoever wants to use them can push their branch there, test it there. But I'd imagine an enterprise org doing this, and they just have like, I don't know, hundreds, thousands of environments potentially floating around. That an ephemeral environment setup could allow them to like spin up, spin down, it's gone. They only it's like pay as you go almost.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's important to take a step back and understand how the ephemeral environments are created and how they're destroyed. So we're leveraging Octopus Deploy runbooks to create the environments and obviously destroy the environments as well. And so when a new environment is detected for the first time or a new branch is detected for the first time, when you do a push up there, what it will do is that will trigger a provisioning runbook to execute. And then after a certain period of inactivity, which is configurable, the default is 1 week. So if you don't do any releases for that particular ephemeral environment for 7 days, then it will automatically deprovision that environment by running that deprovisioning runbook. Now, naturally, you can configure that to be, hey, I want to do it after 2 days or 1 day, or I think I saw hours. I hadn't played around with it too much. I just started messing around with it this morning because I got a chance to really dive into it. But yeah, so like you can be as restrictive as you want because I know that with some folks who are doing something like with trunk-based development, it might the environment or you might only need it to live for half a day.
Hmm.
So maybe to say, hey, after a day, go ahead and kill it. I don't really care about any of that. So going back to your point, yes, it can be a cost savings because you have the ability to automatically provision, but also you have a mechanism to automatically deprovision after a certain period of inactivity. Um,
Nice.
And that's
Yeah.
the cost control. Cleaning up after yourself is the key to this, and it's one of those cases where people might say, well, we're kind of busy, so we might end up having more of these ephemeral environments than we would have had just static environments. But then what they were paying in is the opportunity cost because they were all having to queue and block each other.
yeah.
And usually that's probably a more valuable amount of dollars than the cost of an ephemeral environment. So, so yeah, I think that it's an interesting thing that there's two sides that you can be paying on this, but
Hmm.
ephemeral environments helps you both sides of that.
Hmm.
I sometimes think when you break it down to like this capex cost on these cloud things where you have these ephemeral environments that you're spinning up and spinning down, it can be a bit myopic at times because you're just looking at the Azure bill or your AWS bill. And yes, that can be a big scary number. I won't disagree. And you need to have appropriate guardrails in place. There was one person who worked here when they first joined. They spun up, I think it was like a 32 core virtual machine and just left it running for like a week. I was like, that's come on, man. That's a bit pricey. Like we need to have appropriate guardrails in place where it makes sense. Don't allow people to spin up these massive virtual machines unless you absolutely need them and then monitor them. But you also have to think about the time that's wasted in terms of going around and saying, "Oh, you're testing on the wrong environment." So imagine a QA person spends an hour or let's say 2 hours a week testing on the wrong environment. I mean, that adds up over time over a 52-week year. Um, you know, that if you assume like the dollar amount per hour, because I know every company out there, anytime they pick up a project, they're always looking at, okay, per developer hour, how much is this going to cost us? And typically they'll t-shirt size it, so like a small, medium, large, or
Hmm.
something like that. And so when you waste time, that's a big killer. And so this avoids that type of situation because you can make sure that everyone's kind of speaking to the same page, even though you might end up with more of these ephemeral environments and you might end up with a slightly higher cloud bill. At the end of the day, you are saving time on the back end, not trying to organize and coordinate and do all these different things with everybody.
Where do ephemeral environments fit on the scale of miniature versus should be like production? Because we know that our
Mm.
staging environment really needs to be as close to production as possible. But is that true for ephemeral environments, or can they be more micro?
Now, are you asking my opinion, or are you thinking in that sense?
Let's do both, Bob.
Let's do both. Yeah. So I one of the core pillars of continuous delivery is always going to be testing in prod-like environments. So I think the configuration should be the same. So for example, if you're deploying to Kubernetes, you should be, in production, you should obviously be deploying to Kubernetes in dev and test. Now, the actual compute resources, I think that's where you can get a little, you can massage that a little bit. Because if you're in a dev environment, maybe you don't need it. I don't need 16 core nodes on my Kubernetes cluster because I'm not running at that scale. And so I think there's an appropriate trade-off between
Mm.
the two. I am in a prod-like environment. All the configuration is the same, but the resource size might be slightly smaller. Just like, when you learn how to drive on a car, you know, my geo tracker that I learned how to drive on. If you don't know what those are, look up. Like I think it was like a Mitsubishi Sidekick was the closest analogy. It's this tiny little thing that I learned how to drive on, but those lessons still applied for when I got my truck, and now when I have my Subaru. It's the same core thing. It's just a slightly different size. I think that's probably much more important is that you have the right configuration, but the compute sizes can be slightly smaller.
Mm.
Yeah, so same tech, same versions of stuff.
Yes.
Like keep as much the same as you can, but just like don't spend the same money, right? It's you don't have a million users in your ephemeral environment. You have one or two users maybe. And when we're probably not doing load testing on our ephemeral environments, we'll probably have a dedicated environment for that we use to do
Yeah.
it.
So I guess one question that I would have for you is when we talk about ephemeral environments, does this mean that we're spinning up entirely new infrastructure for everything? Or can we go off of some shared infrastructure? So I'll give you an example. Let's go back to Kubernetes. Do I have to spin up an entirely new Kubernetes cluster for my ephemeral environment, or do you think we should just be able to get away with doing something like namespaces? Same thing with databases. I don't need to spin up a whole new SQL server. I just want to create a new database inside of SQL Server with an appropriate name for my ephemeral environment that everything can connect to.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I mean, isn't this how this kind of containerization came about? Because someone sat down and said, we've got like 10,000 computers in this office, most of which aren't doing much right now. So if we could run our test environment spread across all of this compute, we could save a ton of money and get ourselves a load of environments. So it kind of feels like, you don't have to spin up a brand new cluster for an ephemeral environment. You would have a cluster that you can pop those environments onto. That seems like a very sensible way of doing it. I realize how difficult it is to say ephemeral once you've said it this many times. I think I've said it about five different ways now.
I honestly I haven't noticed, so maybe I've heard it five different ways. I've heard it so many times I'm just kind of immune to it at this point in time.
It's one of those words I think you just begin to doubt yourself in your own mind,
Yeah,
but it sounds fine out loud.
it's like yeah,
Yeah.
but I and so I think that's one of the scarier things is when we talk about creating and destroying infrastructure. There's this concept of like I need to create and destroy these entire virtual machines or these entire Kubernetes clusters, these entire SQL servers. And in reality, for a lot of these ephemeral environments, if you have this capability for this shared style of infrastructure, especially like on a Kubernetes cluster or a SQL server, or even within a like a Linux or Windows virtual machine, I think that's perfectly fine to do that. Like you don't have to go whole hog and be like truest or purist when it comes to these types of environments because again, the whole point of these environments is you want to get fast feedback from your stakeholders, from your QA people, from the appropriate people to make sure you're building the right thing. You don't need the whole like isolated this type of thing. But at the same time, there are scenarios in where you do have to create and destroy actual resources. A really good example would be, say, platform as a service. You do have to create a new Azure web app or an AWS Lambda or an Azure function. And so that does require something where you might have to leverage, say, entirely infrastructure as code on something like that. So it's going to be obviously a healthy mix. There's also going to be situations where it does make sense of this truly needs to be isolated on its own infrastructure. But I would treat that as more of the exception rather than the norm and for this type of feature.
So here's an interesting one. In order for ephemeral environments to spin up and tear down at will, you're going to be letting this automation run against some infrastructure.
Hmm.
So, is it sensible to have a subscription that is separate from your production subscription if you're using cloud, so that the API keys wouldn't work on production? Or if you're on more traditional infrastructure, maybe a different domain. so that any access doesn't cross into the production domain. Is that a reasonable safeguard for this?
Yeah, I think so because you can. Yeah, absolutely, because you can scope to these different. So sorry, one of the challenges, obviously, with ephemeral environments is how do we handle scoping of environmental variables, specifically within Octopus Deploy? Because you can scope, I want this is my connection string to dev, this is my connection string to test and staging and production. And that's super simple when you have static level environments. So one of the concepts that we introduced within Octopus was this concept of it's a parent environment. And so I think that's the actual term we use. I'll have to double check the docs, but internally, that's what we called it. Anyway, so what you can do is you can scope values to that and that particular parent environment, and with you knowing, hey, I'm going to have some sort of environmental qualifier on this to say I need to add the ephemeral environment name to whatever I'm doing with this particular variable value. So, okay, knowing that, you can then also scope accounts to those ephemeral environments within Octopus Deploy. So be it the AWS or Azure or GCP and say this particular account is only for ephemeral environments or this particular worker pool is only for ephemeral environments and I want you to use that. So yes, it would definitely behoove you to separate that out. I think that's just good practice in general. Like you shouldn't have production access across the board for all environments, regardless if they're ephemeral environments or static environments.
Yeah, there's two problems you can have. One is that you do something in production and it can't see the database, and you're like, why is that? That's kind of a bad problem. But the worst problem is that the reason for this is that you're pointing at the test database, and if it can see it, then you're now running and unaware that your production stuff is going into a test database. So yeah, or I think there are good reasons to have some layer of separation between production and test, just in case you ever do something accidental and silly. So yeah,
Yeah, it's funny because I think some of these questions and some of these concepts, ephemeral environments has probably brought them more to the forefront because now you have to make these decisions because that's part of the proper configuration versus you run it, it fails, you run it, it fails, you run it, it fails. You kind of do that whole just constantly just stomping the next problem in front of you. And so you might not realize that this is a problem until a little bit later. So I guess that's one of the good things is this definitely brings a lot of that forward. Because yeah, some of the questions you've been asking me, it's like, yeah, that's really applicable to anything, not necessarily just ephemeral environments.
we're moving into a kind of world where we don't want anything that needs to be nurtured over the long term. Like the ability to just be able to recreate something is so powerful. And it's funny because when you think of how we were doing disaster recovery a little while back, which was having an entire additional data center
Mm,
like ready to kind of get going if something went wrong, and you're paying for all of this additional infrastructure, and then you finally have this event where you need it, but your hosting provider is like, oh man, so many of our customers are phoning up right now asking us to switch to the failover data center that there's a big queue. It's going to take us hours. And you're like, wow, we've paid for this infrastructure for like 5 years of not needing it. And now the day we need it, we can't even get the benefit of it. So yeah, this the ability to just create stuff on demand, I think that's beneficial for a whole bunch of scenarios. One of which is it'll make ephemeral environments easier, right?
yeah.
Because if you're in Kubernetes world, you're used to things being thrown away and recreated anyway. That's how it works. So
Yeah.
makes things much easier.
Yeah, it's the disaster recovery scenario. That's one that's always been interesting to me because the whole concept of I want to recreate my entire environment when a disaster occurs. And that scenario you just described happens more, it also happens at scale if an entire, say, data center or entire region goes down. Now everyone's going to go to the secondary region and try to get all of their infrastructure spun up. And so then that secondary region is going to be like, now we're resource starved as well. So it's it's always this fine balance, I think, between uh, being able to quickly recreate the environment on demand for cost savings versus having something available, but constantly updating it and keeping it refreshed. And so it's available, but maybe in a, I think that we call it a warm state for
Mm.
situations where it is mission critical and you need to be able to spin it back up in a very timely manner. So the resources are already pre-allocated, but they're just kind of in a turned off state or not being used state.
Yep.
Is there a crossover with ephemeral environments and I suppose platform teams, or like how they operate at scale in terms of how they standardize? You might have a Kubernetes team, you might have a GCP team. Is it boiled down to, hey, there's a runbook, and if you're on one of these teams, you use this runbook, or can you build it into, I don't know if there's a platform hub crossover where you kind of like you can build a part of that process that just sits in there, and then we sort of centrally control how it happens and let teams have at it when they need it.
Yeah, so that's really the kind of the long-term vision of project templates within Platform Hub. So you have the runbooks available to create and destroy your infrastructure. That is part of the template. You just get that as part of free. It's just there. So that makes it a lot easier to kind of configure all of that. So yes, you can set those types of standards and make sure that everyone's following it. And that might be one of those things that you don't let the consumer modify whatsoever. It's like, these are the runbooks you're going to get. This are the templates that are going to be in there. You might be able to inject some steps inside of the actual like uh, create or destroy runbook processes themselves. But overall, I suspect those templates could probably be fairly locked down, um, with some capabilities for some, additions on top of that. But yeah, absolutely. I think that this would be something that at scale would make a lot of sense, and you would want to have consistency, because I think that would be one of the biggest concerns is if you have thousands of developers and hundreds of teams and they're all creating and destroying infrastructure however they want and there's no rhyme or reason. And in fact, this is something that we run into internally because, say on my team, we all have our own personal instances and we have a sandbox Azure subscription, and oftentimes there's no rhyme or reason to how we name anything. It's just like I name it one way, Mark names it another way, Ryan names it another way, and so the standards are kind of just a little bit more loosey goosey, but that's fine because this is a sandbox environment. No one really cares. But in a production level environment or something where you're trying to scale this out and have a bit of control and a bit of sense of normalcy, that would be something that absolutely you'd want to do.
Hmm. Makes sense. Yeah. Very cool.
Good
So
naming can make something look immediately wrong when a mistake has been made. That's the great thing about naming.
Yeah.
You should be able to scan a list of names, whether it's variables in code or the names you've given infrastructure or the tags you're using. You should be able to look down that list and something will stand out because it's wrong. And that was
Yeah.
like the original idea behind Hungarian notation was supposed to be that you would see on one line of code that, oh, this is wrong. Like I've got an unsafe string being written onto the page. It's obviously wrong. That needs to be encoded, right? It's like it should just give you that click. So I'm quite a stickler when it comes to really solid naming conventions. And if someone challenges it and says it should be different, I'm the person who was like, fine, we're renaming everything so that the convention is still obvious and clear. Like there's no the historic convention and the new one. Everything has to be renamed.
Yeah, that naming is one of the hardest things to begin with. Proper naming of variables, proper naming of files, proper naming of namespaces, anything. Um, and one of the things that it's funny, one of the things that I started discovering within Platform Hub was the need to have really clear and unambiguous names. So having a naming convention. So to give you an example, we were pushing out policies right now, and I just pushed up the policies best practice, and I said, establish a naming convention before you get started. Establish a naming convention where the prefix indicates what it's quote unquote hooked into. So a deployment run or a runbook run, or it's for both. And say deployment and runbook run. That's the prefix hyphen and then the template name. The template name can be whatever makes the most sense, but always have that prefix so you know exactly. So you also, with naming, you want to reduce the psychological burden as to what it's doing. You want to have it be very clear. Nothing's more frustrating than opening up a file that's 2,000 lines long or 3,000 lines long, and it's just one function, and at the very top it just says var x, var I, var z, and you're like, oh my God, what does any of this mean? And so, yeah, that's the hardest thing. And so, yeah, you want to remove that kind of that psychological weight or that burden of forcing someone to have to go through literally everything to understand exactly what you're doing. So even the smallest little naming convention on your process, sorry, on your process templates or your policies or your variables within your variable sets or within your projects, it just helps out so much.
It's always obvious what something should have been named when you're trying to find it. That's the best.
Yeah.
That's when you really learn what it should have been called. When you're
Yeah.
searching and you can't find it. It's like, well, I couldn't find it for any of these search terms. That's probably what it should have been called.
Yeah. I think the hardest thing, honestly, is when you don't have a naming convention for so long, and then you decide to retroactively add it, and then it's just okay. Now you've put on the burden of how do we fix this problem? Because I mean, your two choices then are okay. We're going to stop everything, and we're going to go through this whole effort to rename literally everything, or force people as part of it. Hey, if I'm in this particular area, for example, I'm in Octopus Deploy, I'm going to go through and I'm going to update the variable names. But then you add scope onto that work. And so that's, I think, the hardest decision is to retroactively do it. So again, that's why establishing it as soon as possible is the most important thing when it comes to naming.
Mm.
Not the most important thing in general, but when it comes to naming, the earlier the better.
Yeah, for sure. We're almost at time. Steve, do you want to finish up with any of your strange questions about what books people are reading or things they're doing?
Yeah. So I have a question that I'm going to give with very little context, which is mandatory or optional?
Oh.
Oh, that it always depends on the
It's the
scenario,
one we
doesn't
need the
it?
context.
Yes. Like, is it mandatory to read, say, Hackers? I would say yes. Is it optional? Is it optional to read? Is it optional to read The Goal? I would say no. It should be mandatory.
Yeah, I can't disagree with that actually. I think the goal is kind of it's kind of central to pretty much everything we touch as humans.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's impossible to actually queue up for a coffee when you're out and about without thinking through that whole thought process. You're watching how it's working and you're like, this is bad. I can
yeah,
see exactly what is being done wrong here.
yeah, yeah. It's something that I didn't think I would reference as much, but the more after I read it, the more I thought about it, the more I was like, yeah, you're absolutely right. Um, So, yeah, I've been rereading Hackers recently, and so that's if you've never read it, it's a fantastic book. It covers the very beginning of computing, starting in the MIT labs in the 50s and 60s, and then as it exploded out into the West Coast with Stanford and uh, the I just want to say the University of Utah, which is actually true. And then it proceeds on from there to the personal computer revolution that occurred near Berkeley with Homebrew Computer Lab, and then sorry, Homebrew Computer Club. Then it goes on to the Apple II, and then at part three. Now I just got to part three, and now they're following gamers. And so the big one that they followed was Sierra Online, which was the creator of King's Quest and Space Quest, which are that's my bag. That's what I grew up on. So like I always enjoy rereading some of that stuff.
Nice. I'm going to add that to my list. Yeah.
So Tony, what about you? Mandatory or optional?
Depends. No, it does. Depends what the context is for me. Yeah. I'm gonna
My
go.
answer to this question is everything is optional. I remember one of my psychology books, they talk about a student came to the teacher and said, I really want to hand in my paper for this course on time, but I can't because I have to do practice for the football team. And the teacher just kind of sat with them for a bit and just said, "You don't have to, do you? It's like a choice. You're making a choice about whether you submit this paper and get your grade in this class, or you participate in the team, right? And the student was like, but it's not really a choice. And it was like, well, it is a choice. It's optional, right? You're going to either flunk this class or you're going to upset your team. And that is the choice you have. It's just not a nice choice. So, but don't pretend that you're being forced because you have already suggested that what's more important to you is the team. It's not a right or wrong answer, but like that's what you've kind of said. You've signaled it. So, yeah, for me, optional, I think, is the answer.
The That's also directly out of the Seven Habits of Highly Effective People. I think that's literally the example that he used but instead of football team, it's like visiting parents or something like that. But yes, yeah, that's the exact same thing. I think the idea is that you take ownership of your choices. So it's not when you say something is mandatory, you, hey, this was mandatory, I had to do it. You shift the choice that you made and the ownership of that choice from you as a person to something else that's abstract. It's a policy. It's my manager that made me do it. It's the CEO made me do it, whatever the case may be, versus this is the choice that I personally made. And when you start taking ownership of your choices, then yeah, it definitely makes a huge difference in your life.
Hmm. Yeah. I I would still say it depends. Because there are there are there are some like, and everyone will work differently, but there will be bits and like I need to convince my brain that it is mandatory or I won't do it. It's like there's hard like I kind of believe you should try to do hard things every day, whether it's work, whether it's life, whether it's whatever. Doing hard things is a good process and thing to work through. And if I was convincing
Yeah.
myself they're all optional, I wouldn't do many hard things. Be like, no, not
I
today.
mean, it's not entirely all optional. I mean, death is pretty mandatory.
Yeah.
We'll see. We'll see. I'm not conceding that one yet.
Yeah.
I have a very
Oh.
good track record on this so far.
Of not dying, yeah.
Yes.
There's an old
Oh.
Simpsons line. It's like, I don't know why you're so concerned about death. I mean, you could wake up dead tomorrow.
That is it. Yeah,
But no,
indeed.
definitely an interesting thought experiment because yes, I'm more of the belief that it's more about taking personal ownership of your choices.
Mhm.